The judge dismisses the black girl's case in court, unaware she's the daughter of a high-ranking NSA officer. Imagine a courtroom sealed in pin-drop silence where the future of a bright young girl, wrongly accused, hangs in the balance. Her face is brave, her stance unwavering. Across from her sits a stern, dismissive judge who barely conceals his contempt. He's already made up his mind about her guilt based on nothing more than the color of her skin. Little does he know that quiet girl in front of him is no ordinary defendant. She's the beloved daughter of a high-ranking National Security Agency officer, a man with power and influence capable of shaking the very halls of justice. This is their explosive story. Evelyn Davis's morning began like any other for a 17-year-old juggling high school and volunteer work. She hopped off the bus 2 blocks from her private high school in Arlington, Virginia, deep in thought about her upcoming debate tournament. Beneath her calm exterior simmered a unique blend of ambition and potential, shaped by a family that insisted she could conquer any obstacle. Her father, Colonel Arthur Evans, was a high-ranking officer at the National Security Agency stationed at Fort Meade. Her mother, Dr. Eleanor Evans, was a respected neuroscientist conducting research on PTSD in military veterans. They'd raised Evelyn to be disciplined yet compassionate, competitive yet fair. Today, her strides were purposeful. She was heading to an off-campus bookstore to pick up a newly released historical biography for extra credit in her AP history class. She thrived on knowledge and believed strongly that understanding the past prevented repeating its mistakes. As she browsed the shelves, she overheard an argument near the front counter. A flustered store clerk was accusing another student, someone Evelyn recognized from a rival public school, of shoplifting. The student, a boy named Martin, vehemently denied the accusation, but the clerk wasn't having it. Hesitant but morally compelled to intervene, Evelyn approached just in time to witness a misunderstanding escalate. Martin, in a panic, fled the store. The clerk, a man in his 50s with a hawkish gaze, decided that if he couldn't nab Martin, he'd go for the accomplice, which in his eyes meant the only other black teenager in the vicinity. "Olivia, young lady, you're not going anywhere," the clerk snapped, blocking her path as she tried to leave with her purchased biography in hand. Evelyn's eyes widened in shock. She had never even met Martin personally. She was simply guilty by association, her skin color in the wrong place at the wrong time. Fear spiked in her chest, yet she remained composed, brandishing her receipt to prove her innocence. "I paid for my book. I did nothing wrong," she asserted, her voice level. But the clerk wouldn't budge. He pulled out his phone, dialed 911, and barked into the receiver that he'd caught a thief. Soon, security officers swarmed the store, though they quickly realized the situation was suspicious. Evelyn's story was consistent, backed by the date-stamped receipt. Nonetheless, to Evelyn's horror, the store's manager insisted on pressing charges, claiming a conspiracy between Martin and his friend. Within minutes, Evelyn found herself in the back of a police cruiser, not handcuffed, but certainly under suspicion of petty theft. A nauseating cocktail of disbelief and betrayal churned in her stomach. She couldn't believe how quickly her day had gone from ordinary to surreal. She'd always heard cautionary tales of racial profiling, but she never dreamed she'd be ensnared like this. Her father's face flashed in her mind. Colonel Evans, always the proud soldier, had taught her to remain calm under pressure. He drilled into her a sense of protocol. If you ever encounter law enforcement, comply politely. Let the truth come out. But the reality of seeing the outside world blur through tinted windows was enough to rattle her. She clutched the biography to her chest, a lifeline to rationality, while dread coiled in her gut. When they arrived at the police station, an officer took her statement. Another rummaged through her belongings, confirming everything she had said. The store clerk's story was already full of holes. A single line in the police report read, "Suspect match description," which basically boiled down to her being African American. Eventually, an exasperated detective called Colonel Evans, who rushed down to the station. He arrived in uniform, exuding an aura of unshakable authority that caused everyone in the lobby to straighten their posture. Under normal circumstances, the mere mention of Colonel Evans of the NSA was enough to make local police tread more cautiously, but what had been set in motion was already rolling forward. The store manager refused to drop the charges, and local law enforcement felt pressured to proceed with an arraignment rather than risk accusations of favoritism. They let the wheels of the justice system begin to turn. That day ended with Evelyn being released to her parents, tears in her eyes. Her father's jaw set with a fury she had never witnessed. His anger was cold, directed not at his daughter, but at the reality of injustice that she'd been forced to taste. They all agreed they would fight this baseless charge. The family was no stranger to battles, and they believed wholeheartedly in the concept of justice. Evelyn had been wronged, and the truth would prevail. However, none of them could foresee the storm that awaited them in court. Evelyn tried to refocus on her school responsibilities, but a sense of dread kept her awake at night. Rumors circulated in her community. Some classmates gave her sympathetic looks, others suspicious side eyes. She kept her head high, remembering her father's words, "We will clear your name, Evie." Behind the scenes, Colonel Evans and Dr. Eleanor Evans worked around the clock to contact a reputable lawyer. They gathered any piece of evidence that could prove their daughter's innocence. Security camera footage from the bookstore was rumored to exist, but no one had yet produced it. Perhaps it was lost. Perhaps the store was withholding it. Nobody seemed sure. The entire Evans family prepared for a legal skirmish, never guessing that it would morph into an all-out war, one with the potential to shake the entire judicial system of Arlington and beyond. The day of the arraignment arrived with a grim hush. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she stepped into the wood-paneled courthouse. She wore a neat, modest navy blue suit, her mother's idea of a professional yet approachable outfit. At her side, Colonel Evans stood tall, his uniform replaced by a conservative dark suit. Dr. Eleanor Evans was equally poised, wearing her composure like armor. Their lawyer, Catherine Moore, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for championing civil rights cases, met them at the entrance. She gave Evelyn a reassuring nod, but her expression was tight. She knew the presiding judge, Judge Robert Peterson. Judge Peterson had a reputation, though it was rarely spoken of openly. He was known for running his courtroom with an iron fist, cutting off defendants mid-sentence, and pushing swift decisions that often favored prosecution. People whispered about his bias, particularly toward minority defendants. Officially, no one wanted to accuse a sitting judge of racism without irrefutable proof, but the rumor mill spun with stories of him handing out harsh sentences to Black and Latino defendants while letting affluent white defendants off lightly. No one had dared to launch a formal investigation, at least not yet. The courtroom's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, intensifying the tension. Evelyn felt the weight of every stare. The bailiff directed them to the defense table. On the other side, the bookstore's manager, George Wilson, appeared smug, whispering to a prosecuting attorney who looked equally confident. The manager's eyes flicked over Evelyn, his lip curling. It was a look that made Colonel Evans's blood pressure spike. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Robert Peterson," the bailiff announced. A tall, lean man in his early 60s entered, black robes swishing around his lanky frame. He scanned the room, and his gaze rested on Evelyn for an uncomfortably long moment, a coldness creeping into his eyes. He settled into his high-backed chair, rapped the gavel once, and motioned everyone to sit. Case number 3478, Commonwealth versus Evelyn Davis, announced the clerk. Judge Peterson peered over his half-moon reading glasses. "The defendant is charged with petty theft, correct?" Catherine Moore rose. "Yes, Your Honor, but my client is completely innocent of these charges. We have reason to believe." "I'm sure you do," the judge interrupted, sarcasm dripping from his tone. "But let's proceed with the formalities." Evelyn noticed the slightest sneer on the judge's lips. A wave of unease coursed through her. She glanced at her father, who maintained a stoic composure, but she could sense the tension in his posture. The prosecutor made a brief statement, painting Evelyn as an accomplice to a shoplifter, weaving a tale of a cunning plan. The bookstore manager nodded vigorously through the entire spiel. When Catherine began her statement of defense, pointing out Evelyn's impeccable academic record, her family's standing, and the lack of any stolen items found in her possession, Judge Peterson cut her off repeatedly. "Point of order, Ms. Moore. We don't need her entire biography. This is an arraignment, not a biography reading." Catherine's cheeks flushed with anger, but she kept her voice calm. "Your Honor, we believe the charges are unfounded and request a dismissal." Request noted. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Do we have probable cause here?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied, brandishing a statement from the store manager. Eyewitness testimony confirms MS. Davis was present when the alleged theft occurred. We suspect collaboration. The judge squinted at Evelyn. Young lady, do you have anything to say for yourself? Evelyn swallowed hard. It was a simple question, but the scorn in his eyes stung. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stood. Your Honor, I'm innocent. I paid for my book. I had no involvement in any theft. Judge Peterson slammed the gavel once for silence, even though Evelyn spoke in measured tones. That's enough. The facts remain to be determined. I find sufficient cause to proceed to a formal hearing in 2 weeks. He shot Catherine a look. Prepare accordingly, counselor. And just like that, it was over. The Evanses left the courtroom feeling as though they'd just walked into a lion's den. Outside, Colonel Evans felt the corners of his eyes burn with anger he could barely restrain. He pulled Catherine aside. What just happened in there? He wouldn't even let her finish a sentence. Catherine exhaled sharply. Judge Peterson, she muttered. He's notorious. But we'll fight. I'm going to petition for that security footage. The store has to produce it if it exists. Colonel Evans glanced at his daughter, who stood nearby with her mother, fighting tears of frustration. He made a silent promise to himself. He would do everything in his power, and he had considerable power, to see justice served. Officially, he had no jurisdiction over local courts, but he had resources and networks. If Judge Peterson wanted to sabotage his daughter's future out of prejudice, he'd soon discover he had tangled with the wrong family. Walking away, the Evanses sensed they were stepping into a labyrinth. Evelyn, hugging her arms to ward off an internal chill, tried to summon her father's confidence. She told herself that the truth always wins, but as they filed out of the courthouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that Judge Peterson had already decided her fate. Judge Robert Peterson had been on the bench for over 2 decades, appointed initially by the governor, who prized his tough-on-crime attitude. Over the years, that stance seemed to morph into tough on anyone who doesn't fit my idea of right. In hushed tones, some attorneys joked that Peterson would convict a fish for swimming if it looked at him the wrong way. Others claimed he was simply stern and by the book, but the statistics whispered another story. People of color received disproportionately harsher rulings from him. His personal life was equally elusive. He kept few close friends, and the same stoic face he wore in the courtroom rarely cracked in social settings. The occasional fundraiser or legal conference was about the extent of his public presence. Yet behind the scenes, a complex web of influences shaped his courtroom decisions. Late one evening after the arraignment, Peterson trudged up the steps to his suburban townhouse. His wife had passed away years ago, leaving him in a fortress of solitude. He dropped his briefcase, letting out a weary sigh. A flicker of guilt passed through his mind as he recalled the day's cases. The sight of Evelyn Davis, dignified, poised, and unwavering, had caused a strange twinge in him he couldn't quite articulate. But old prejudices die hard. His father, a strict man who had raised him with a certain worldview, had hammered into him that trouble often came from those people. And though Peterson had never admitted this aloud, those biases had wormed their way into his decision-making. He turned on the TV for background noise. A news segment flashed across the screen. NSA Director John P. Harrison meets with high-ranking officers to discuss cybersecurity threats. Peterson barely registered the significance, flipping to a different channel. He wasn't one to follow national security news. He'd rather watch a game or an old movie. If he had known that Colonel Arthur Evans worked under that very leadership, Peterson likely would have scoffed and dismissed it. After all, he was used to being the highest authority in his world, a small kingdom governed by the sound of his gavel. Meanwhile, in the Evans household, a very different scenario was unfolding. Colonel Evans sat in his study, scrolling through legal precedents and referencing internal NSA resources. He wasn't naive enough to tap official NSA intelligence for personal matters. He respected boundaries, but he knew people who had access to public records aggregated in ways that went beyond normal civilian channels. He was determined to see if there was anything in Peterson's background that could be relevant. A gentle knock sounded on the study door. Eleanor stepped in, her eyes tracing the lines of tension on Arthur's face. "How's Evelyn?" he asked without looking up. "She's in her room, trying to study, but she's upset. She keeps replaying the moment in the bookstore, blaming herself for not leaving sooner or speaking up differently." Arthur closed his laptop, rubbing his temples. "This is not her fault. She did everything right. But we're dealing with something bigger than a misunderstanding. That judge has something about him feels off. Eleanor perched on the edge of the desk. Peterson is rumored to be biased, even corrupt. If we can find proof, maybe we can get him recused, or at least keep him on a tighter leash. Arthur exhaled heavily. I'm going to speak with some contacts. Nothing shady, just verifying public records. I refuse to let bigotry decide my daughter's future. A subtle edge sharpened his voice. He was a man used to fighting battles on foreign soil or through layers of bureaucratic tangles. This time, the battlefield was domestic, and the stakes far more personal. Unbeknownst to him, a far deeper conspiracy was about to unravel. The next day, Colonel Evans made phone calls to old military friends. They directed him to a retired Army intelligence officer turned investigative journalist named Brian Miller. Miller was widely respected for exposing corruption within city councils, police departments, and occasionally even the legal system. If there was a paper trail proving Peterson had a pattern of discrimination or shady dealings, Miller was the man to find it. Their initial phone conversation was curt and to the point. I can't promise you anything, Miller warned. But I've heard the name Peterson come up in discussions around suspicious sentencing disparities. If you're willing to cooperate, I can dig around. Just be aware that the higher the corruption, the more pushback we might face. Colonel Evans didn't hesitate. Do it. This is my daughter's future on the line. That same evening, Miller got to work, sifting through digital archives, courthouse documents, and local news articles spanning the past 2 decades of Peterson's career. Patterns began to emerge. Murmurs of unusual alliances, donation records from questionable donors to Peterson's re-election campaigns, and anecdotal stories of coerced pleas from minority defendants. Back in the Evans home, Evelyn mustered the courage to voice a question that had been gnawing at her. Dad? Mom? What if we lose? What if the judge just decides I'm guilty? Eleanor pulled her in for a hug. We won't lose. The truth is on our side. Evelyn sighed, pulling away gently. But what if the truth isn't enough? Her words hung in the air, an unspoken fear they all shared. Arthur placed a firm hand on her shoulder. I won't allow that, Evelyn. We'll uncover the truth about this judge if there's anything to uncover, and we'll fight back legally and ethically. You have my word. Although his words offered some solace, an uneasy tension continued to envelop the house. The Evanses dined together, each lost in their own thoughts about the upcoming hearing. Evelyn found her appetite lost, pushing her food around on the plate. Once again, she felt the specter of prejudice, a force she never fully understood until it bared its teeth at her. In another part of the city, Judge Peterson finished grading briefs late into the night. He glanced at Evelyn's case file stacked with others, his mind drifting momentarily to her father's stern gaze. A lesser man might have suspected something was amiss, that the father who wore a uniform was not merely an ordinary soldier. But Peterson, entrenched in his own arrogance, simply chalked it up to parental defiance. He snorted and flicked off the desk lamp. Tomorrow would be another day of repeating the same cycle. Defendant after defendant, gavel strike after gavel strike. What none of them knew was that the fuse had already been lit. A confrontation loomed, one that would expose deeply entrenched injustices and challenge the entire foundation of Judge Peterson's dominion. The question was not if the system would break, but when, and whether Evelyn Davis's case would be the final blow. 2 days before Evelyn's formal hearing, Catherine Moore filed a motion to obtain any and all surveillance footage from the bookstore. The prosecutor claimed none existed. Colonel Evans found that suspicious. Bookstores, especially large ones, typically had cameras for security. Why wouldn't a store manager who was so eager to press charges have turned over footage? Smells like a cover-up, Brian Miller remarked when Evans told him the latest. The investigative journalist had spent countless hours scouring Peterson's rulings. Not necessarily the judge's direct doing. Could be the store manager is doubling down on his claim. Might be worried that the video doesn't support his story. Evans grunted in agreement. We need that footage to clear my daughter. Without it, it's our word against his. Meanwhile, Miller had already uncovered questionable financial links in Peterson's past, campaign donations from organizations with xenophobic leanings, memberships in private clubs rumored to exclude minorities. Nothing was definitively illegal, but it painted a troubling picture. The puzzle pieces hinted at a worldview that could easily translate into prejudiced rulings. Amid these developments, the Evanses tried to maintain a sense of normalcy at home. Dr. Eleanor Evans continued her research work, providing therapy and examining neural processes in veterans grappling with PTSD. She poured more hours into her lab than usual, as if immersing herself in scientific rigor could distract her from the swirling chaos of injustice. Evelyn returned to school, braving whispers in the hallways. Some of her peers believed in her innocence, while others seized the chance to gossip. Her once comfortable world felt shaky. Still, she persevered, spending evenings practicing her debate skills and reading up on her rights in the legal system. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse was abuzz. Journalists and local activists had gotten wind of the trial. A small group of protesters stood outside, holding signs that read "Stop Racial Profiling" and "Justice for Evelyn." While it was far from a citywide march, the demonstrations signaled that the community was paying attention. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Judge Peterson took his seat, his gaze flicking over the gallery, landing briefly on the signs visible through the windows. He pursed his lips in disapproval before calling the court to order. "We're here to hear the evidence against MS. Evelyn Davis," he announced. "MS. More. Is the defense ready?" Catherine rose, adjusting her glasses. "Yes, Your Honor, though we've recently learned that the bookstore security footage is allegedly unavailable. We believe the prosecution does not have sufficient evidence to prove my client's guilt." The prosecutor stepped forward. "We have corroborating witness testimony from the store manager, George Wilson, as well as a clerk who claims MS. Davis was acting suspiciously." Catherine took a steadying breath. "In the absence of video evidence, we request the store manager's direct testimony, and we'd like to cross-examine him." Judge Peterson nodded. "Very well. Call Mr. Wilson to the stand." George Wilson swaggered in, head held high. He recounted his version, spotting the suspicious teen boy, seeing Evelyn come in around the same time, and concluding that they worked together. He used words like furtive and shifty to describe Evelyn's demeanor. Catherine probed him on details, exact times, camera coverage, the possibility that Martin, the actual shoplifter, might have acted alone. Wilson was evasive. He maintained Evelyn was complicit, offering no direct proof but leaning heavily on instincts gleaned from years of dealing with people. The tension in the courtroom thickened. Colonel Evans watched from his seat, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Evelyn sat stoically, hands folded, her heart pounding. She could feel Judge Peterson's gaze pinning her, as if she were already wearing an orange jumpsuit. When it was Catherine's turn to cross-examine Wilson, she pressed him on the missing footage. "Mr. Wilson, can you confirm the exact reason why no security camera footage is being provided?" Wilson's eyes flicked to the prosecutor. "Our system was malfunctioning that day." "Malfunctioning?" Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Did you file a maintenance report or notify the manufacturer? And yet you testified you've dealt with people for years and rely on technology for security." Wilson stumbled. We have. It must still be in process." A bead of sweat glistened on his brow. The judge exhaled impatiently. "MS. More, get to the point." Catherine continued undeterred. "My point is that the only evidence we have is the word of Mr. Wilson, who stands to avoid a negligence lawsuit if he pins the blame on MS. Davis, without video or any stolen items found on MS. Davis, the prosecution's case rests on shaky ground." Wilson stiffened. "She's guilty. I saw it in her eyes." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the courtroom gallery. The phrase, "I saw it in her eyes," echoed with the same ring as centuries of prejudice. Colonel Evans clenched his fists. Eleanor laid a hand on his arm, pleading silently for calm. Judge Peterson rapped his gavel. "Order. That's not legal evidence, Mr. Wilson. So keep your personal impressions to yourself." For a fleeting moment, it seemed like Peterson might rein in the prosecution. But then he cleared his throat. "Given the conflicting accounts, I'm not prepared to dismiss at this stage. We'll proceed with a jury trial in 2 weeks. Bail is set at $5,000, which I assume the defendant can manage." Catherine immediately filed the paperwork. Colonel Evans signed off on the bail in seconds. Before adjourning, Peterson locked eyes with Evelyn. "Next time you're in my court, I expect you to show respect and keep your answers concise. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Evelyn replied softly, feeling anger roil inside her. She had barely said 2 words during the entire proceeding. As the Evanses left the courtroom, a small knot of reporters crowded around them. Catherine guided Evelyn away, But Colonel Evans addressed a few direct questions, reiterating their stance on her innocence and the store's suspiciously missing footage. Judge Peterson emerged to see the cameras turned toward Colonel Evans, in uniform, giving statements that subtly implied the court was not handling the case fairly. Peterson's lips thinned. He recognized a direct challenge to his authority. That evening, Colonel Evans got an update from Miller that made his heart pound. "I found something in Peterson's record of rulings," Miller said. "A pattern of sentencing disparities is one thing, but I also uncovered a 1995 complaint filed by a black defendant for racial bias. It was never resolved. Might be a lead." Evans rubbed his chin. "This might help, but it's not enough to get him recused. We need something stronger." Miller paused. "I'm still looking into certain documents. There's a rumor that Peterson might have been involved in questionable dealings with local business owners. Backroom deals, possibly hush money. If we can prove that, his entire career could be jeopardized." "Keep me posted," Colonel Evans said grimly. "No matter what it takes, my daughter will not become another statistic." Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Peterson seethed at the thought of a uniformed NSA officer undermining him. He made a few phone calls to acquaintances in law enforcement, fishing for any dirt he could dig up on the Evanses, only to come up empty. The Evanses were squeaky clean. The father's record was exemplary. The mother was an accomplished scientist. The daughter was an honor student. His frustration mounted. As night fell, each side prepared for the coming legal storm. Colonel Evans and his family steeled themselves for a tough fight, buoyed by the hope that justice, no matter how slow, would prevail. Judge Peterson, feeling threatened, doubled down on his convictions. And like a crack in a dam, the first signs of an impending flood began to show. All it would take was one forceful push, one undeniable piece of evidence, to sweep aside the carefully built walls that protected Judge Peterson and to finally set Evelyn free. As the trial date approached, Colonel Evans's circle of support widened. Former military colleagues, longtime friends, and even concerned activists reached out, offering everything from moral support to legal advice. Donations started trickling in for Evelyn's defense fund, although the Evanses were financially stable enough not to need them. Still, the gesture showed how many people believed in her. A particularly surprising ally emerged in the form of a local civil rights organization. The group, spearheaded by an attorney named Richard Lee, caught wind of Evelyn's case and recognized the hallmarks of racial profiling. Lee, a charismatic man with a booming voice, contacted Catherine Moore, offering to assist pro bono in any way needed: legal research, expert witnesses, or even a public demonstration. Catherine, seeing the advantage in numbers, welcomed the help. During a weekend strategy meeting at the Evanses' home, Lee laid out his ideas. The dining room table became command central, cluttered with files, photos, and digital tablets. "We have to frame this as more than just a misunderstanding at a bookstore," Lee insisted. "This is about a pattern of systemic prejudice in the local justice system, embodied by Judge Peterson." Colonel Evans nodded, scanning the documents Miller had provided on Peterson's shady campaign finances. "That's exactly what we suspect," he said. "But we need indisputable proof if we're going to take on a sitting judge." Miller, seated at the table, tapped his laptop. "I'm close to finding that proof. There's a local business association that includes George Wilson, the bookstore manager, and other store owners who've supported Peterson's re-elections. The pattern of campaign contributions is odd. I suspect pay-to-play, meaning these business owners donate to Peterson's campaign, and in return, he ensures favorable rulings if any disputes come to his court?" Eleanor asked, her brow furrowed. "Precisely," Miller affirmed. "If I can get one or two of those business owners or employees to spill the beans about deals made with Peterson, we can blow this case wide open." A sense of determination swelled in the room. Evelyn quietly observed the adults strategizing on her behalf. Part of her felt gratitude, but another part bristled. She felt powerless, a spectator in her own life. Yet, as she listened, a new resolve sparked within her. She was a strong debater, used to searching for truth and using words as weapons. Maybe she could do something too. After the meeting, Evelyn caught Miller in the hallway. "Mr. Miller, you said you might speak to employees at these businesses? Let me help. I can talk to people too. Sometimes people might be more willing to talk to a sympathetic face than to a journalist." Miller looked at her thoughtfully. "I admire your spirit, kid, but this could be risky. These people might be under pressure from Peterson." She shrugged. "I'm already under pressure. I'm not a child, Mr. Miller. I can handle it. He studied her eyes, finally nodding. All right, I'll see if we can arrange something, but let's keep it discreet. That night, Evelyn wrestled with anxiety. Tomorrow, she would try to talk to a clerk who worked at a hardware store rumored to be in the same business association as Wilson's bookstore. She didn't want to put herself in danger, but she felt compelled to do more than just watch. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Peterson was meeting an ally of his own, District Attorney Joseph Thompson, an old friend from law school. They convened over whiskey in a dimly lit lounge, the kind with plush leather chairs and an air of exclusivity. I hear there's a lot of noise about this Davis girl, Thompson remarked, swirling his glass. Civil rights groups, media interest. You sure you can handle the heat? Peterson's jaw tightened. She's a disrespectful brat with a father who thinks wearing a uniform makes him above the law. I won't let them turn my court into a circus. Thompson raised an eyebrow. Robert, this is bigger than just one family. If you push too hard and it comes out that you've been cutting deals, it could bury us both. A flicker of anger crossed Peterson's face. Don't presume to lecture me, Joseph. I've maintained my seat for 2 decades, and no one has ever been able to pin anything on me. This Davis fiasco is just another overblown sob story. They'll lose interest once the next scandal comes along. Yet for all his bravado, doubt not at him. The colonel's unwavering stance, the swirling public sympathy, and the involvement of activists all felt like a slow, encroaching tide. He tried to drown his worries in another sip of whiskey. Unbeknownst to him, at that exact moment, Brian Miller sat in his car outside the hardware store, checking his phone while Evelyn hovered in the passenger seat. She'd insisted on tagging along, using the excuse of wanting to buy some items for a school project to strike up a conversation with a cashier rumored to be Wilson's cousin. You don't have to do this, Miller reminded her, turning the engine off. I want to, Evelyn responded firmly. I can't just sit and wait for my life to be decided by people like Peterson. They walked in, hearts pounding. The store was nearly empty, giving them an opportunity for a quiet conversation. Evelyn approached the counter with a few household items in hand. The young cashier, wearing a name tag that said Denise, rang them up. Miller stood nearby, pretending to browse. Hey, Denise, Evelyn said gently. I heard this place is part of the Arlington Business League. Is that right? My father's in the military, and we're new to local associations. Denise's eyes flicked to Evelyn's face, a shadow of nervousness flitting across her features. Yes, that's correct, she replied cautiously. I was just curious. Does your association include the bookstore on Maple Street, the one owned by George Wilson? Denise's posture stiffened. It does, yes. What? Evelyn mustered a friendly smile. Well, I've been hearing rumors. Some folks say Mr. Wilson is close to a Judge Peterson. I'm just trying to figure out if these rumors are true or if people are making up stories. Denise swallowed hard, glancing around to ensure no one else was in earshot. I don't know what you've heard, she whispered. But Mr. Wilson's been bragging for years that if he ever got into trouble, the judge would bail him out. Something about campaign donations. I really shouldn't say more. Encouraged by the admission, Evelyn leaned in. My name is Evelyn Davis. He's pressing false charges against me. I just need the truth. Denise's eyes flicked in recognition. You're that girl. She paused, lowering her voice even more. Wilson told people at a recent meeting that the judge would make sure she doesn't cause any more trouble. It sounded vindictive. They were laughing about it. I left early because it felt wrong. A cold wave of realization washed over Evelyn. This was confirmation that Wilson and Peterson might have a personal or financial arrangement. Thank you, she said sincerely. This helps a lot. Miller approached, giving Denise a polite nod. Would you be willing to sign a statement or speak on record about this? Fear clouded Denise's face. If Wilson or the judge found out, I could lose my job, maybe worse. I don't have money for lawyers. She hesitated, then exhaled shakily. But I also can't stand by while an innocent girl's life is ruined. Let me think about it. A flicker of hope ignited in Evelyn's chest. I understand. Thank you for hearing us out. They left the store, adrenaline coursing through them. For the first time since this ordeal began, Evelyn felt a glimmer of empowerment. She had contributed to the investigation, uncovered real evidence that Peterson and Wilson were likely conspiring. As they drove away, Miller gave her an approving nod. You did good, kid. Evelyn stared at the passing streetlights, feeling the storm of conflicting emotions, fear, anger, hope. She whispered to herself, I'm going to fight this. I'm going to win. What she didn't know was that simultaneously, Peterson had received an anonymous tip that Colonel Evans's people were digging around the business association. Rage flashed in Peterson's eyes. He picked up his phone and dialed Wilson, his voice cold with barely contained fury. You said this Davis girl would be a non-issue. Now she's stirring up the entire community. Keep your mouth shut and make sure your people do the same, or we both go down. The battle lines were clearly drawn. Allies had emerged on both sides as the looming trial threatened to erupt into a full-scale legal war. One thing became certain. The final showdown would either bring justice for Evelyn Davis or cement Peterson's iron rule. The day of the trial arrived under dark, heavy clouds that threatened to release a downpour at any moment, an apt reflection of the tension humming through Arlington's courthouse. Journalists, activists, and onlookers packed the courtroom. Colonel Evans's uniform lent him a commanding presence, while Dr. Eleanor Evans exuded a calm resolve. Evelyn appeared tired but determined, her shoulders squared in quiet defiance. On the prosecution's side, the mood was distinctly smug. Judge Peterson presided with the same cold demeanor, the lines of his face set in stern disapproval. In his mind, the case was already decided. He had the store manager's testimony, no incriminating video for the defense, and the seemingly unwavering support of the district attorney's office. Nothing, and certainly not a teenage girl, would topple him. Catherine Moore began by outlining the defense's case in her opening statement. She pointed out the inconsistencies in the prosecution's argument, the suspicious absence of video footage, and how no stolen items were ever found on Evelyn. You will see, Catherine concluded, that this trial is built on prejudice and nothing more. We ask you to remember that justice must be blind to color and immune to personal bias. The prosecution droned on with the same talking points. Evelyn was near the shoplifter. It was suspicious. The manager's word should be enough to convict. Then the witness testimonies began. Mr. Wilson took the stand again, parroting the same accusations, though the cracks in his story were more evident than before. When it came time for cross-examination, Catherine's voice rang clear. Mr. Wilson, you've testified that the store security system was malfunctioning. Have you provided documentation of any service calls to the court? Wilson looked uncomfortable. No, we haven't gotten the paperwork yet. And you are part of a local business association, correct? Yes, Wilson muttered, glancing nervously at Peterson. Catherine nodded. Would you say that members of this association are supportive of each other's ventures, possibly offering campaign contributions to local officials such as Judge Peterson? Judge Peterson's expression darkened. Careful, mess. More, he warned. That line of questioning is irrelevant unless you have evidence to substantiate it. Catherine paused for dramatic effect. Actually, Your Honor, the defense has new evidence. We've recently obtained statements. She glanced at Denise, who sat in the gallery, eyes downcast. That certain members of the business association believe you and Mr. Wilson have a quid pro quo arrangement. Chaos erupted. The prosecution objected, the gallery murmured excitedly, and Judge Peterson's gavel thundered. Order. Ms. Moore approached the bench. She complied, meeting the judge's glare with unwavering calm. Your Honor, we have legitimate reason to suspect that Mr. Wilson's accusations against my client are motivated not by facts, but by an understanding that you would favor his side in court. Peterson's face paled with anger. This is outrageous. Baseless conspiracy theories. Catherine stood her ground. I'm prepared to call a witness from the association to testify. At the very least, I believe this court should permit that testimony to proceed. The judge's gaze flicked to the prosecutor, who looked uneasy, then to Wilson, whose face was covered in cold sweat. Peterson recognized that if he outright denied the motion, it would look suspicious. He had to keep up the facade of fairness. Fine, he snapped, but keep it brief. And if this is some fishing expedition, you'll regret it, Ms. Moore. Denise took the stand, trembling slightly. She quietly recounted how Wilson had bragged about Judge Peterson's support and that he'd specifically mentioned how the judge would take care of Evelyn Davis. The courtroom listened in rapt silence. The prosecutor tried to poke holes in her story, but her sincerity was evident. Catherine let the final blow land when she presented documented logs of Wilson's campaign contributions to Peterson's re-election fund, which had been uncovered by Miller. The amounts, dates, and frequent large sums painted a clear pattern. These donations are suspiciously timed around legal disputes involving Mr. Wilson's businesses, Catherine said pointedly, letting the implication hang. Judge Peterson tried to cut off the line of question again, but the cat was out of the bag. The jury, the journalists, everyone could see the smoke. Where there's smoke, there's fire. It was Colonel Evans's turn to take the stand. Although not an eyewitness to the alleged theft, he was called upon to affirm Evelyn's character and highlight the suspicious nature of the case. Dressed in a simple suit instead of his uniform, he spoke firmly. My daughter is a law-abiding citizen. She's a volunteer, an honor roll student, and has never been in trouble. We believe her only crime that day was sharing the same skin color as someone else in that store. Peterson shifted uncomfortably on the bench as Colonel Evans continued. I don't say this lightly, but I believe the evidence suggests that Mr. Wilson has manipulated this charge and, in doing so, may have relied on a pre-existing understanding that his interests would be protected in this courtroom. The gavel slammed. That's enough, Colonel Evans. Peterson barked. We're here to decide a petty theft case, not to impugn the entire judicial system. But the seeds of doubt were firmly planted. The final twist came when Brian Miller, in the middle of the trial, handed Catherine a freshly printed document, an affidavit from another business association member who'd also overheard Wilson boasting about the judge's favoritism. Miller had secured it at the last minute, placing a final nail in the coffin. Peterson saw it being passed, and his face contorted with fury. The writing on the wall was clear. After closing arguments, the jury needed less than 2 hours to deliberate. They returned a verdict of not guilty. Relief and triumph surged through Evelyn, her family, and their supporters in the gallery. The defense team exchanged emotional hugs. But the real aftermath was only beginning. As soon as the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted into a frenzy of media questions. Judge Peterson tried to maintain order, but the catcalls from journalists asking about his campaign donations drowned him out. He stormed out, ignoring the barrage of inquiries. Outside, Colonel Evans and Evelyn faced a throng of cameras. Catherine Moore took the podium. Justice has prevailed today. This was never just about a young girl's innocence. It was about shining a light on the potential corruption within our judicial system. The fight isn't over. We call for an official investigation into Judge Peterson and his relationship with George Wilson. Evelyn stood by her father, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. The crowd cheered and applauded. Lee, from the civil rights organization, stepped forward to announce plans to file a formal complaint with the state's Judicial Conduct Board. In a matter of hours, the story exploded online. Hashtags like Justice for Evelyn and Peterson Exposed trended on social media. The local news stations played clips of the damning testimony on repeat, while op-eds demanded a deeper probe into Peterson's rulings and those possibly influenced by bribes or racist biases. The wave that Colonel Evans had feared and simultaneously hoped for finally broke upon the shores of public opinion. Judge Peterson, locked in his office, seethed with disbelief. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls from the district attorney, political backers, even old connections who were now desperately distancing themselves from him. The rumor that the Judicial Conduct Board would suspend him pending an investigation spread rapidly. He was trapped, cornered by a truth that refused to stay hidden any longer. Meanwhile, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of victorious relief. She no longer felt small or powerless. She was free, her name cleared, her future intact. She felt the warm press of her father's hand on her shoulder. He leaned in, whispering proudly, "You stood tall, Evie. We all did." She exhaled a shaky breath, tears of joy finally slipping free. But through it all, a quieter realization took hold. Their fight wasn't just for her. It was for every person who'd been silenced or railroaded by a system that should serve justice instead of prejudice. And though this chapter of her life was finally closing, she knew a new one had just begun. In the weeks following the trial, the fallout was swift and far-reaching. Investigations into Judge Peterson's past cases revealed a clear pattern of disproportionately harsh sentences for people of color. Complaints about impropriety, which had been buried for years, came surging back to the surface. The media frenzy made Peterson's name a national headline, and not in the way he had ever anticipated. With damning evidence of questionable campaign contributions and potential collusion with local businesses, the Judicial Conduct Board wasted no time issuing a statement of suspension. Reporters camped outside Peterson's home for days, capturing images of him through half-drawn curtains, looking pale and haggard. His once ironclad reputation lay in tatters. George Wilson fared no better. Denise's testimony had prompted others who'd worked with or for Wilson to come forward. Allegations included wage theft, harassment, and false accusations against other patrons of color. His bookstore was soon the target of a boycott as community protests grew. Wilson shuttered the doors, claiming the media had sparked unfair scrutiny. In truth, he was simply running from the avalanche of lawsuits. For Colonel Evans and his family, a sense of normalcy began to return. Evelyn tried to make up for lost time at school, catching up on assignments, and stepping back onto the debate stage. She felt more confident, wiser, though a part of her still reeled from the public attention. Classmates who had once whispered behind her back now came forward to apologize or express admiration. She accepted their words with a quiet, mature grace that belied her age. One afternoon, she was called into the principal's office, expecting more post-trial administrative formalities. She was surprised to find the principal holding an official letter from a National Student Leadership Foundation. They'd heard about her ordeal and wanted to invite her to speak at a youth conference on racial justice and legal reforms. The principal, a middle-aged woman who'd always been polite but distant, now regarded Evelyn with a soft respect. "Evelyn, they're offering you a platform to share your story," the principal said. "It's an incredible opportunity for someone your age." Evelyn felt a swirl of emotions, but pride was foremost. She nodded, tears threatening to well in her eyes. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "If it can help prevent someone else from going through what I did, then absolutely." Meanwhile, Colonel Evans received a discreet message from higher-ups at the NSA. Word of his personal battle and ultimate victory had reached the upper echelons of the agency, including General John P. Harrison himself. While Evans had never used NSA resources inappropriately, the commitment and integrity he'd shown in defending his daughter reflected positively on the agency's values. Evans was quietly informed that future advancement within the NSA was likely, as his leadership qualities were evident both at home and on the field. One evening, a phone call came that caught the entire family by surprise. It was from an aide to the governor of Virginia. The aide conveyed that the governor wished to meet Colonel Evans and Evelyn for a private discussion regarding judicial reforms. Cautious yet curious, Evans agreed. In the governor's mansion, they found themselves in a stately office, old portraits adorning the walls. The governor, a tall woman with a disarming smile, greeted them warmly. She admitted that the revelations about Peterson had jolted her administration into reassessing the judicial appointment and oversight process. "We were all asleep at the wheel," she confessed. "Your case, Evelyn, has made me realize how urgently we need reform." The meeting concluded with the governor asking for their input on drafting new legislative proposals to ensure more robust checks on judicial power. Evelyn listened, astonished that her story, her once terrifying ordeal, had become a catalyst for real change. All the while, the media spotlight continued to shine. Their home was inundated with interview requests, some from national outlets. Colonel Evans, protective of his daughter, limited their public appearances, but he and Evelyn did agree to a major interview on a reputable evening news program, hoping to convey a message of hope and reform rather than vengeance. On air, Evelyn spoke softly but firmly. "I don't hate Judge Peterson. I hate what he stood for. I hate that prejudice can blind people to the truth. My hope is that what happened to me will inspire more people to stand up for fairness, for each other." The response was overwhelming. Viewers flooded social media with messages of support. More victims of judicial bias began to speak out, feeling emboldened by Evelyn's courage. Investigations sprang up in neighboring counties, shining light into dark corners that had long been hidden. Throughout it all, the Evanses maintained their humility. Eleanor continued her research, using her expertise to aid veterans suffering from trauma. Colonel Evans returned to his duties at the NSA, albeit with a higher profile, and Evelyn, still juggling school and volunteer activities, began crafting her speech for the youth conference, determined to articulate her journey in a way that resonated with others who might feel voiceless. For Judge Peterson, the world continued to shrink. Under intense pressure, he resigned before a full-blown impeachment process could begin. His final act in public office was a terse letter that avoided an outright admission of guilt but lamented the unfair scrutiny placed upon him. Few believed him. When a camera crew tried to interview him on his front lawn, he snapped, "I have no comment," retreating inside. His neighbors watched him from behind drawn curtains, their expressions a mix of pity and disdain. The karma Evelyn had hoped for arrived swiftly, though she took no pleasure in it. As her father taught her, justice is not about revenge, it's about making things right. In the hush of a late autumn afternoon, as fallen leaves rustled along the sidewalks, Evelyn stepped outside her home. She took a deep breath, gazing at the neighborhood that had become a battleground of public opinion just weeks ago. She smiled softly. Her life had changed forever, but so had the lives of many others who had been touched by her story. The fight for justice had demanded courage, sacrifice, and integrity, and in the end, it was worth it. Months passed, and life for the Evanses settled into an uplifting rhythm. The slow burn of reform continued throughout Virginia's legal system. New committees were formed to scrutinize judicial appointments, focusing on transparency and campaign donations. The local bar association, stung by the scandal, tightened ethics requirements. A quiet revolution was underway, a direct consequence of the stand Evelyn Davis and her family had taken. One crisp morning, Evelyn found herself in a crowded auditorium at a youth leadership conference. The sight of hundreds of young people from diverse backgrounds gathered to engage in topics like social justice and civic responsibility was humbling. She nervously clutched the index cards that contained her prepared speech. Her name was announced, and polite applause filled the room. She stepped onto the stage, scanning the sea of faces looking at her with curiosity. Clearing her throat, she began. "My name is Evelyn Davis. A few months ago, I stood in a courtroom, falsely accused of a crime I didn't commit. I was scared, not just of the verdict, but of how easily my skin color could overshadow my innocence in the eyes of some. But I wasn't alone. My family, my community, and people who believed in justice stood by me. Because of our collective effort, we exposed corruption and gave a voice to those who might never have been heard." A wave of applause, more robust this time, rolled through the auditorium. Evelyn smiled, nerves settling. What happened to me wasn't just about one judge. It was about a system that sometimes fails those it's meant to protect. It can be overwhelming, especially for people my age, to believe we can make a difference in something so big and entrenched. But let me tell you, one voice can ring out in a dark room, and it can encourage others to speak. Eventually, it becomes a chorus. She spoke for another 15 minutes, recalling how crucial allies had been. Catherine Moore, Brian Miller, Richard Lee, Denise from the hardware store, and her own parents, Colonel Arthur Evans and Dr. Eleanor Evans. She ended with a challenge to her audience, to never doubt their power to enact change, to stand up when they see injustice, and to support those who are wrongly accused. When she finished, the auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. She felt tears prick her eyes, not from sorrow but from gratitude and renewed purpose. Stepping off the stage, she was mobbed by young attendees wanting to share their own experiences, ask for advice, or simply say thank you. In that moment, Evelyn realized that her ordeal had transformed her into a beacon of hope for many. Back in Arlington, Colonel Evans watched a live feed of his daughter's speech from his office at the NSA. Pride radiated from him. Next to him, Eleanor dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "She's amazing," she whispered. "She is," Colonel Evans agreed softly. In that quiet moment, he remembered the swirl of events that had led them here, the unjust accusation, the racist judge, the heartbreak of watching Evelyn suffer, and the intense legal battle. Yet from that chaos, a new path had opened for her and for countless others.